What a healed empath actually becomes. Carl Jung's darkest truth you've been taught. That healing makes you softer, that the finished version of you forgives faster, opens easier, loves without condition. That is a comfortable lie. It's kept an entire generation of empaths trapped in a cycle they mistake for growth. Carl Jung spent his career studying what happens when a fractured psyche becomes whole. And for the empath, the truth is darker than the mythology admits. Integration doesn't make you more open. It makes you nearly impossible to manipulate. Not through coldness, but through precision. That precision quietly dismantles every relationship, every family role, every arrangement that was ever built on your unconscious availability. Here's what nobody tells you about that process. It doesn't feel like healing while it's happening. It feels like losing yourself. So let's start where it actually starts. Back before any of this, when your sensitivity was still running you instead of the other way around. The uncalibrated instrument before integration, the empath lives in a state Jung would have called undifferentiated receptivity. There is no filter between what belongs to you and what belongs to the room. You feel the tension in a car before anyone raises their voice. You feel the resentment under a compliment. You feel the exhaustion someone is trying to hide behind a joke. This isn't a gift you asked for. It's a nervous system trained by necessity. Somewhere in your early life, safety depended on reading a mood before it became words. Maybe it was a parent whose silence was more dangerous than their shouting. Maybe it was a household where the stated rule and the actual rule never matched, and you learned to navigate by the gap between them. Children in that kind of environment don't develop empathy the way it's romanticized. They develop surveillance, constant, exhausting. Involuntary surveillance of everyone's emotional weather. Because missing a shift in that weather had consequences, that surveillance system works. It becomes frighteningly accurate. But it comes at a cost nobody warns you about. While your perception was sharpening, your boundaries were dissolving. You couldn't tell the difference between noticing someone's pain and absorbing it. You couldn't tell the difference between understanding someone's anger and inheriting it. Jung's term for this was something like unconscious identification. The collapse of the line between self and other, where their unprocessed material moves into you and sets up residence as if it were always yours. Once that line collapses, everything downstream is distorted. You walk into any room and leave carrying pieces of everyone in it, their grief, their shame, their unspoken fury at a life they didn't choose. None of it belongs to you, but you have no framework for putting it down, so you carry it the way you'd carry your own. The architecture of self-erasure here is what the unhealed empath does with all of that absorbed material. Builds an identity out of it. You didn't decide to become the one who holds everything together. It happened in increments, each one small enough to seem voluntary. You became the child who managed the household's emotional temperature before you were old enough to manage your own homework. You became the friend who could be called at any hour, who never ran out of patience, who somehow always understood. You became the partner who could sit with anyone's darkest confession and not flinch, who mistook that capacity for love instead of recognizing it as a survival pattern still running on autopilot. Every one of those roles required the same sacrifice. You buried a little more of yourself under the weight of what you were carrying for other people. Boundaries started to feel like betrayal. Saying no started to feel like abandonment, not of the other person, but of some version of yourself that believed your worth was measured by how much you could absorb without breaking. So you said yes when your body was screaming no. You stayed in rooms, relationships, and situations that every internal signal told you to leave. You smiled through your own quiet disintegration, because somewhere along the way you'd confused endurance with virtue. Jung saw this pattern in patient after patient who arrived at his door with no obvious pathology, no clean diagnosis, just an overwhelming sense of drowning in psychological material that wasn't theirs. They weren't sick. They were saturated. They had become receptacles for the things other people refused to look at in themselves. The denied anger, the unacknowledged shame, the parts of the psyche too uncomfortable to claim. And because none of that material was labeled or contained, it moved through the empath like weather moves through an open window. Consider what years of that does to a person's relationship with themselves. When your attention is permanently pointed outward, cataloging everyone else's emotional state, you lose the muscle required to locate your own. You become fluent in reading a stranger's discomfort across a room and illiterate in naming what you, yourself, are feeling in that same moment. A sophisticated instrument, calibrated entirely for external detection, with no dial pointed inward. That is the pre-integration state. Maximum perception, zero protection, and a form of self-abandonment so consistent it gets mistaken for compassion. The rupture Jung understood that most people don't choose transformation. They get forced into it. For the empath, the forcing mechanism is almost always the same, a betrayal specific enough, and by someone close enough, to shatter the operating system that got you this far. It is rarely a stranger. It is usually the person you protected the hardest, the one you made the most excuses for, the one you were certain would never treat your openness as a resource to be mined. And then the evidence becomes impossible to reframe. You realize the pattern wasn't affection being returned imperfectly. It was extraction, dressed up as intimacy. You were never fully seen as a person. You were used as a function, the one who forgives, the one who absorbs, the one who never runs out of understanding no matter how badly it's abused. Jung would call this an encounter with the shadow, except for the empath it's more precise than that. It isn't only about seeing someone else's darkness clearly for the first time. It's about confronting the part of yourself that already knew and chose not to act on what it knew, because acting on it would have cost you the relationship, the role, the identity you'd built your entire sense of worth around. That confrontation forces a choice that can no longer be postponed. You can keep absorbing, keep explaining away what your own perception has been telling you for years. Keep overriding your instincts to preserve a connection that was never mutual. Or you can finally trust what you always knew and refused to name. Integration doesn't happen through affirmations. It happens through the much harder admission that you were complicit in your own erosion. That every time you silenced your own read on a situation to protect someone else's comfort, you committed a small act of violence against yourself. The turning point isn't a dramatic confrontation. It's the moment you stop committing that violence. You look at the person who exploited your openness and feel something unfamiliar. Nothing. No urge to fix them. No need to be understood by them. Just a flat, unshakable clarity where the old compulsion to rescue used to live. What comes after is not what you were promised. The self-help version of healing tells you that you'll return to a state of trust, that you'll soften back into the person you were before things got complicated. That is not what happens. You don't go back, you sharpen. Integration means every quality you suppress to remain palatable gets brought into full conscious use. Your intelligence, your capacity for honest, sometimes brutal assessment, your willingness to let people face the consequences of their own choices instead of absorbing those consequences for them, your ability to walk away without narrating the reasons, your talent for spotting manipulation before it fully forms. None of these are character flaws. They are operational necessities you were taught to be ashamed of. And the moment shame stops attaching to them, everything reorganizes. Jung's model of this transformation moves in 3 distinct stages, each one requiring you to abandon a comfortable illusion about who you're supposed to be. Stage 1. You stop absorbing. The first stage sounds deceptively simple. You stop functioning as a container for other people's discarded emotional weight. The mechanism behind it is specific. You develop the capacity to observe someone's emotional state without internalizing it as your own. Someone directs their frustration at you. Previously, you would have absorbed it instantly, scanned your own behavior for the cause, tried to repair whatever you assumed you'd broken. Now you simply watch it happen. You recognize the emotion as theirs, moving through them, landing near you, but not inside you. You see the projection for what it is in real time, and you decline to take it in. To the person on the other end, this looks like withdrawal, but as reflection. Their emotional content has nowhere to go except back to them. They're left holding what they were trying to hand off, and most people cannot tolerate that. They escalate. They accuse you of turning cold, of not being who you used to be. They're not wrong. You aren't who you used to be. That version of you operated on autopilot. Guilt-based manipulation collapses at this stage because the entire mechanism depends on you accepting responsibility for someone else's internal state. The instant you simply observe the attempt instead of absorbing it, the manipulation has nowhere left to land. You're not being cruel. You're just no longer standing where the blow was aimed. Stage 2. You become ruthlessly selective. The second stage unsettles people who believe an empath should be endlessly, universally available. You start applying real discernment to who gets access to your interior world, and that discernment is not the same thing as building a wall. Walls are defensive, reactive, built out of fear. Selectivity is strategic. You're still fully capable of deep presence, of holding real space for someone's genuine pain, of forming connection at real depth. But that capacity is no longer handed out indiscriminately. It's reserved for people doing their own work. People who respect a boundary without immediately testing its edges. People capable of sitting with their own discomfort instead of outsourcing it to you. For everyone else, you simply become unavailable. Not hostile, not reactive, just closed. The person who used to function as an open door becomes a threshold with conditions attached. And those conditions are not up for negotiation. You don't explain them. You don't defend them. You don't soften them so someone else feels more comfortable. Here is where the difference between being nice and being kind becomes operationally important. Nice is conflict avoidance dressed up as virtue. Kind is clarity, even when clarity is uncomfortable to deliver. The integrated empath stops performing nice. They become kind in ways that plenty of people will experience as harsh. Kind enough to let someone face the natural outcome of their own choices. Kind enough to refuse to enable a pattern that's destroying them. Kind enough to say no without an apology attached. Kind enough to end a connection that only ever survived because you kept disappearing to keep it alive. None of this selectivity is judgment. It's pattern recognition, built from years of watching the same personality structures produce the same outcomes across dozens of relationships. You no longer need months of evidence to know whether someone is operating with integrity. You know within the first few interactions, not through some mystical sixth sense, but through the enormous unconscious database you've been compiling since childhood, whether you meant to or not. Stage 3. You become predictive. The third stage is the one that would genuinely alarm most people if they understood its full implications. Because by this point, you've become what Jung would call psychologically differentiated to a degree most people never approach. You're not simply reading emotion anymore. You're forecasting behavior. Think about what all that absorption was doing all those years. Every emotional state you took in, you were logging as data. Every room you read, you were cataloging as pattern. Every time you sensed intent before someone acted on it, you were quietly training a predictive model of human behavior, one interaction at a time. The unhealed empath collects all of this and then feels guilty for using it. Second-guessing accurate instincts, calling herself judgmental for detecting danger that was actually there. Overriding a correct internal alarm because ignoring it felt more compassionate. The integrated version trusts that database completely. When every signal in your body is telling you someone is lying, don't need external proof. You already know, and you act on it without apology. A healed empath is formidable precisely because of this. You see a manipulation attempt before it fully materializes. You clock the lie about where someone was before the sentence finishes. You feel the shape of a request designed to obligate you several moves before it arrives. You know because you've watched this exact sequence play out before, more times than you can count. Micro-expressions don't lie to you. Vocal patterns don't lie to you. The rhythm underneath someone's behavior doesn't lie to you. This is differentiated perception operating at full capacity, and it means you're processing psychological information most people never learn to consciously access. Here's the detail that separates the integrated empath from someone who would simply become a different kind of predator. You could absolutely use everything you now understand to hurt people. You understand manipulation mechanics as well as anyone who practices them professionally. You know precisely which insecurities to target, which fears to trigger, which old wounds would guarantee compliance. You have the entire blueprint memorized. You simply choose not to run it. Jung spent considerable energy trying to understand why some people who reach this level of psychological power use it to protect, while others use it to dominate. His conclusion was that the difference isn't talent. It's a daily, deliberate ethical choice. The integrated empath decides again and again to deploy their capability for protection rather than control. They see every shortcut available to them in nearly every interaction, and they decline to take it. Not because they lack the skill, but because they've built something more durable than skill. They've built integrity. That, more than the perception itself, is what Jung meant by individuation, the full integration of light and shadow into one coherent, self-directed person. The ripple that follows full integration doesn't stay contained to your own psychology. It reshapes the systems around you, whether you intend it to or not. Any family structure organized around dysfunction cannot survive your transformation intact, not because you set out to dismantle it, but because you've stopped being the load-bearing wall that kept it standing. Remove the person who always absorbed the tension, always smoothed the conflict, always sacrificed themselves to preserve an appearance of peace, and the entire structure has no choice but to reorganize around a truth that was always there and never named out loud. The relative whose behavior depended on someone invisibly cleaning up the aftermath now has to face consequences directly, because you're no longer running interference. The family member who avoided their own reckoning by using you as an emotional outlet now has to sit with what they've been avoiding, because that outlet has closed. The person who controlled you through guilt discovers guilt no longer has purchase, because you've stopped accepting responsibility for regulating anyone's feelings but your own. The version of you that made all of this possible is gone, and standing in its place is someone who has decided their own peace outweighs their instinct to avoid conflict. Some relationships survive this and actually deepen. The people capable of respecting your transformation instead of feeling threatened by it. The ones who take your boundaries as an invitation to do their own work, rather than an insult to be punished. Those connections become more honest than they ever were, while you were still disappearing to maintain them. Others don't survive it, and they tend to fall apart loudly. The people who benefited from your unconsciousness will resist losing access to it. They'll recruit allies. They'll construct a version of events where you're the one who changed for the worse, because if you're the problem, they never have to examine themselves. This is exactly where your new capability shows most clearly. You don't defend yourself. You don't explain. You don't spend energy trying to convince anyone of your worth. You simply watch. You let people reveal their actual nature through how they react to your boundaries, and you make decisions from what you observe, not from anger, not from bitterness, but from clarity. That's conscious participation, engaging with the world as it actually is, instead of the version you kept hoping it would eventually become. The individuated self, what you become after this full integration, is what Jung called the individuated self. Someone who has gone down into their own darkness, retrieved what was found there, and come back with capabilities most people never develop, because most people never make the descent in the first place. You stop fearing catastrophic loss the way you used to, because you've already survived losing the version of yourself that believed she had to save everyone to be worth keeping around. You can release anyone who isn't aligned with your own truth, and that freedom makes you magnetic to people doing genuine work on themselves, and quietly repellent to people who are not. Your sensitivity was never the liability you were told it was. It was always a sophisticated perceptual instrument, sitting dormant until it got paired with boundaries, discernment, and self-trust. You're not less sensitive now that you're integrated. You're consciously sensitive, and that single shift converts sensitivity from a vulnerability into a genuine tactical advantage. You can feel the full weight of what's happening around you and still hold your own center. You can see the worst of what people are capable of and still choose on your own terms to remain engaged with the world. You can be powerful and peaceful in the same breath. Here's the part of Jung's work that gets consistently misread. Healing was never about returning to who you were before you got hurt. You can't go back to that version, and you wouldn't want to. That person was operating unconsciously, running entirely on inherited patterns she never chose. The integrated version is more capable in every way that matters. You're awake. You hold every part of yourself at once. The compassion and the capacity for immediate, clean severance. The gentleness and the steel. The openness and the boundaries nothing can move. You were never too much for the world. You are precisely what conscious growth requires. Someone who can hold space for real darkness without being consumed by it, love without disappearing into the process, and see straight through deception while keeping their own integrity fully intact. The unhealed empath spends years asking why this kept happening to them. The integrated empath already knows the answer. It happened to forge something that cannot be manipulated, cannot be guilt-tripped back into old patterns, cannot be pulled under by anyone else's unconsciousness. You were never meant to carry everyone. You were meant to carry yourself out, and in doing so, become living proof that this kind of integration is possible. Jung documented this transformation, and it was never a return to innocence. It's an advance into sovereignty. You're conscious, you're integrated, you're operationally out of reach for anyone who ever mistook your awareness for permission. You don't argue your position. You don't defend it. You don't perform proof for anyone. You see the pattern, make your assessment, and act, usually by leaving so quietly that the people who relied on your presence barely register you're gone. No scene, no explanation owed, just absence, and the peace that comes with finally choosing yourself. This is what a healed empath actually becomes.